Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Anti-Doping Podcast, brought to you by the Partnership for Clean Competition. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today we are joined by our guest, Dr. Olivier de Hon. Listeners, Olivier is the Chief Science Officer and Director of Intelligence and Investigations at the Doping Authority Netherlands. Today, we're looking forward to discussing his role there and considerations for measuring doping prevalence, as well as assessing the effectiveness of anti-doping programs and more. So, Olivier, welcome to the show today. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you very much. And thank you for hosting me here.
Well, we are so excited to have you with us, and perhaps we can get into some of the details of your background first. So can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and just how you got interested in sport and science?
I guess in retrospect, it was clear all along. I was born during the Munich Olympics on a Sunday afternoon, where in my country, the Netherlands, the football is always on, the soccer, as you call it. And I was born right during halftime of the major matches. That's what my parents, and especially my father, always tells me. And ever since I was a kid, I loved sport. I practiced my fair bit of sport myself, not at the elite level, but always just for fun. When I started looking around what I would like to study, I understood that there was a study called Human Movement Sciences. And when they had an open day, I walked in and I saw the Olympic rowing boat of two Dutch Olympic champions. And so I just walked up and I said, look, if I go study here, do I work with elite athletes, with Olympic athletes? They said, sure, you can. And I think, this is my study. I'm going to do this. That's where I combined sport and science. And at the end of my study, I wanted to do more with that. That could be done in several ways. But I ended up in anti-doping and I'm enjoying myself ever since.
Oh, very cool. Now, did you participate in any sports growing up?
Yeah, I did football, soccer myself, tennis. And later on, I did quite a bit of athletics. The good thing with athletics is that you already become the master. So all the participants when you're 35. I still considered myself young at that point. So did quite a bit of competition there. But I always liked to do anything. I liked to play American football. I liked to play cricket. I did part of my studies in Australia and I played netball during lunchtime. I like to do anything.
Well, I think that's wonderful. So you kind of took us along your career path up until you were in that program in human movement science. Let's talk a little bit about what happened next. So how did you find your way to your current position?
Like I explained, it started with I just wanted to do something with sport. And I was hired as the scientific assistant to perform a study into the performance enhancement properties of albuterol, an asthma medicine. They needed someone to do that. It was a bit of a coincidence, I guess, that they ended up with me at that time. I just finished my studies, but it was fun to do. So I was the scientific assistant. And then at first we thought we do more asthma-related research, but the funding never came through. And then I became what I call a desk researcher. So I sat behind my desk, followed scientific progress. Sometimes we initiated studies ourselves, especially when they were policy related. For example, our chess national federation and the bridge national federation didn't want to have anything to do with doping practices or doping regulations. So they said, we don't need that. It's not necessary for our sport. So we did a literature study and an expert panel review for that possibility. And every time a policy related scientific question came up, I was involved. The PhD you mentioned came later. I had many discussions about anti-doping with professors and people who were working on several areas, but they were all over the place. The only thing that was common was that they related to anti-doping policies that we were implementing on athletes. And then finally I met a professor and he said, but that's a nice thread that you can follow. It's all involved with policies. But how effective are those policies? And that's when we started talking about that. And I could include some of the old studies in my PhD thesis. I could include some new studies as well. We had long conversations whether I was neutral enough to perform these studies because I was working inside the field. But the benefit of that was that we could also access certain data sets that were not available for people outside of the anti-doping world. So in the end, yes, I got my PhD degree on anti-doping policies and the effectiveness of what we do.
Very interesting. And on the topic of what you do, can you share more about what your current roles entail? We mentioned that you are currently the Chief Science Officer as well as Director of Intelligence and Investigations.
Yeah, so we slightly reorganized our organization. There are quite a few people who have university degrees that are somehow related to anti-doping. We decided not to make one department of it, but I am the coordinator there. And as many of our sister organizations did, we needed to do more with intelligence and investigations. And my board asked me to do that as well, to set up that department. And our main aim was to combine all possible relevant pieces of information, which is scientific pieces of information, but also information from our tip line, also information from the performances that the athletes show. And maybe you see strange changes over there. Combine all possible pieces of information and then either use those to pursue a anti-doping rule violation without the analytical result that we usually have, or at least, and that's what we mainly do, to use all those pieces of information to draft a good national control program and use our finances in the doping control program in the best way possible.
That makes sense. And as I understand, you've worked at the Doping Authority Netherlands for over 25 years now in a variety of different roles over the years. So can you share with us, Olivier, how has the organization changed and maybe evolved over time?
Well, first of all, we've had 3 different names, but for clarity, it's always better just to talk about the current name. And in 25 years, an amazing change. I think I was the 5th person that was employed. There were 5 people when I started, and we were with about 50 now. So that's a huge change. Of course, when I started working, there was not even a World Anti-Doping Code. WADA didn't exist. And we happened to have a front row seat when that happened. One of the symposia we organized in 2001, they had one of the first meetings of drafting the World Anti-Doping Code. So I really have seen progressing the anti-doping work into a profession in its own.
I think that's amazing. And what are some of the Doping Authority Netherlands' current scientific priorities or areas of interest that you're focusing on as Chief Science Officer?
I must admit, I would always like to do more. There are no big projects at this moment going on. Like I said, we try to follow scientific progress as it is. I am also a member of 2 WADA groups. One is a working group on prevalence. You already said you wanted to talk about that a little bit more. I'm also a member of the task force of unintentional doping. And out of those 2 groups, there will be some scientific articles coming out of it. What we try to do is also measure prevalence in itself. I think the last project we had was also something new that comes along for all of us, the esports environment. So we financed a study by an independent institution to look into how big would the doping problem be in esports. And the result is that I think we need to prepare for that as well. I don't think we need the entire prohibited list as we know it now, but obviously the stimulants there, they are being misused in esports and there's a potential of abuse. So that's what we need to look at as anti-doping organizations as well. I think that's the last project that we had.
Certainly. And I think the popularity of esports has just been exploding. So this is certainly an area to watch.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, there's a lot of money involved as well. It could be an incentive. And in the end, any game you play, there will always be some people who like to cut the corners or cheat or whatever you want to call it. So there needs to be some sort of policy there in order to refrain from the excesses that might happen if you don't do it.
Oh, that makes sense. And I think that gives us a flavor of some of the kinds of research that you've been doing over the years. And I know we mentioned you're balancing these 2 different roles. Let's talk a little bit about the intelligence and investigation side. So how does Doping Authority Netherlands use I&I tools to enhance clean sport?
We try to use all different sources of information. We have 5 people working in the department besides me, which is rather big. I'm very happy with that. On the other hand, it's always making choices on what you do and what you cannot do in the time that we have. But like I said, we have a tip line. We try to talk to athletes who sometimes approach us. Sometimes we approach the athletes. We talk to coaches or maybe journalists to learn more about sports, the specific sports, sport environments, and potential doping problems there. Of course, doping is always something that people think it is happening in the other house, in the other country, somewhere else. But sometimes it gets closer to them. And I think it's essential that at that point in time, they can talk to a professional and to someone who might act against it. And that's all the doping authorities in the world. So that's us for the Netherlands.
Very cool. And it sounds like you've got a number of different anti-doping programs there at Doping Authority Netherlands. How do you evaluate the effectiveness of these programs?
That's really difficult. So I thought it was an important thing to do. It's a difficult question. Sometimes people shy away from the difficult questions, but I think we should really do that as well. So it's not like that I can explain the answer now here, let alone in just a few sentences. What I can say, first of all, what it is not the number of doping controls. It is not the number of education sessions or whatever. Those are all important to do, but you never know what you really bring about with your efforts there. When you look at it from different ways, I think the most important piece of information that tells you something about your effectiveness is talking about the prevalence of doping. And that's difficult. It's difficult to ask, but there are certain mathematical ways to get a rather good estimate. I think there is analytical information that gives you part of the answer. And if you have several parts of the answer, well, then that's your answer. And you can talk about how often doping is really happening. And in this sense, I'm talking about intentional doping, the athletes or maybe support personnel, but that is involved, that intentionally wants to break the rules to gain a performance edge. And it will always be an estimate. So it is difficult to evaluate it. And it's certainly not as easy as, okay, this is something that you can do every year and just see how your percentage goes up or maybe goes down. But I think if you do it in a good way, you can do it like every 3 or 4 or 5 years. And then you can really evaluate what you have done and what the result is. It's certainly not only performing doping controls. It is a lot more than that. And then this prevalence figure will also give you some information on what you would do best. I think it's always easier to talk in extremes. If it is below 10%, then there is a minority problem, which is still a problem. Certainly, if this minority of doping athletes win the most, then it's certainly a problem. And I think then you should really look on the control side. But if it's a lot higher percentage, and I think this is, for example, this could happen in certain fitness or bodybuilding competitions, then it's much better to look at the education side of things and invest more. In the end, you need both. You need controls and education, but a percentage of estimated intentional dopers that will give you the right information of how big your problem is and what you can do about it.
Absolutely. I think you brought up some really good points there. And I think this prevalence that you mentioned is a big factor to consider when assessing effectiveness of your work as a national anti-doping agency. And I think all national anti-doping agencies face issues with limited resources. As you mentioned earlier, there's a lot to do and you can't have infinite resources to do everything. So how do you decide where to allocate those limited resources or perhaps to reallocate resources based on some metrics that you're looking at in terms of success of different programs or different areas that you're working on?
That's, of course, a discussion you should have with several of your colleagues, with your foreign colleagues, and especially with athletes and athlete representatives. It is rather easy to lose yourself in day-to-day work, I think, and just to assume, okay, the work is there, this needs to be performed, and at the end of the day, I close my laptop and this is what I've done. But I think it is essential that sometimes you try to rise above that, discuss the implications of our work, the implications of doping behavior by athletes or athlete support personnel, and then discuss together, of course, with the people that give you the finances. In our instance, and I think in many cases, it's the Ministry of Health and the National Olympic Committee. Those organizations will think certain things are important, health and fair competition mainly. And I always like our discussions with the athlete committee and with athlete representatives on what we should do about this. I'm always the first one to say, look, it is a choice to have doping-free sport. Things change. Ethical things change over time. 100 years ago, women were not allowed to participate in sport. 50 years ago, professionals were not allowed to perform in Olympic sport. Things change. Maybe in 50 years' time, we think that there's a better solution to doping, or maybe even that we laugh about the way we pursue doping problems now. But I don't think that's true. When I weigh all the evidence that I see, when I see how effective certain doping substances and certain doping methods are, I think you are killing sport. I think you are making sport into a circus if you allow that. And of course, that's also what's happening right now. This year, we will have the enhanced games. I am very curious what will happen around those games. I think it's very appropriate that they are being held in Las Vegas. I think it's more a circus-like adventure. But hey, there's a public for circuses as well. And we need to discuss this. We need to look at it. And I think we cannot afford as an anti-doping community to just say it is ridiculous and get on with our work. No, this is reality. This is what's happening. There will be some public going there. We need to ask ourselves the difficult questions as well.
Definitely. And I think, Olivier, your response kind of touched on some of the elements of policy relevant to this issue. And I think policy has changed tremendously over the years. You mentioned WADA didn't even exist when you started working there. So let's talk about how the field as a whole really evaluates the effectiveness of anti-doping policies and how the policy side of things evolves over time.
I think it's very good that we are asking ourselves these questions now. In the beginnings of WADA, and I completely admit they had bigger problems to solve at that time, but it was not discussed that much. There was just broad estimates. But when you had a room of anti-doping experts, like 100 doping experts, you had all sorts of estimates who would go all the way. And certainly when certain sports were brought up, people just didn't know. And there were very different perspectives. So I think it is really important to talk about it. In the beginning, I think in the first 10, 15 years of WADA, the phrase unintentional doping could not be mentioned. Those didn't exist. A doper is a doper. I don't know if it's an English word, but I would say a short corner. They were really taking sharp turns when this came up. But I think it is very good and wise of WADA that they set up this task force for unintentional doping, because I think we are making a lot of rules that are affecting the athletes in their everyday lives, in every meal that they eat. And when you do that, you also need to question why you do that and what the consequences are for everybody, also for the clean athletes. And it does not go without saying that you're requiring from people to share their overnight address and a 1-hour time window every day where they are. And when you find them, you take blood and you ask them to urinate under supervision. That's all a lot to ask for, and you need to justify that. I kind of deviate from your question, but what I think I have seen in the policies over the past 25 years is that these questions can be asked more and more. And I think it's our obligation to continue to discuss these things.
Certainly. And I think knowing the doping prevalence, as you mentioned earlier, both unintentional and intentional doping, is kind of this keystone for really identifying whether things are working or not. So let's dig into prevalence a little bit more. Based on the data that we have, what do we know about doping prevalence?
Certainly not enough. There is a lot of discussion of that going on right now. There have been a few publications. For my thesis, I wrote a review about that as well. And at that point in time, there was really just 2 or 3 sources that were credible, that tells you anything credible about prevalence. And they were high. They were in the sport of athletics mainly, maybe 20 to 30%. And that's really high. And there are also discussions, maybe they were too high, maybe the wrong models were used. So that's interesting discussions. But of course, you should always also realize that before 2009, all the figures, we didn't have the blood passport. We didn't have a good analysis method to detect blood doping. And I think still things can be improved, but there have been many improvements on the detection side as well. So I think the prevalence has gone down, but there will certainly always be areas where it is higher because of the social circumstances of the athletes, but also because maybe of a lack of the right analytical tools that are being used. And one thing we know for sure, if you look at the history, if you do not look into the problem of doping good enough, then the problem will just surface and will extend exponentially. So we need to be very vigilant about this. You asked about the current state of prevalence. There is more and more. We are currently working on a review of the numbers itself. So far, we have mainly published on the ways to look into it and what sort of studies you could do to know a little bit more about prevalence. We're working on a review now. And I think in elite sports, fortunately, it is not that big, but there will certainly be a big difference between areas and between sports. And that helps you to focus the resources as well to where the exact problems are.
Definitely. And I think in your response, you sort of hinted at this issue that prevalence is in flux, right? It's not a static measure. So it's not something that you can just sort of calculate once and be done. So
Absolutely. And there will be a big difference between countries, between sports as well, and between times.
Definitely. So let's talk about some of the current challenges or limitations that you face in your attempts to accurately measure doping prevalence.
Let me first start. It is not really something that you can directly question to someone, of course, because it is secretive behavior. So there are mathematical ways to go around it. It's called the randomized response technique. But there are various randomized response techniques and there are various models that you can use there. So what we need is some sort of consensus on what is the best way to measure this. And I think the consensus is quite there. Like I said, the publications are being done now, but that's the biggest challenge to do it. And if we have a worldwide consensus on this, then it can be employed more and more. And I think in the end, in a rather simple way. So I think we are just on the brink of collecting more and more data about prevalence. So it will be interesting times in the upcoming, say, 4 or 5 years.
Very cool. And I think another challenge that follows our earlier conversation is, what are meaningful ways to group data if everything is different across country, across different sports and different populations? So how do you, I guess, come to sort of a meaningful estimate of prevalence that is relevant when you have all these different contextual factors?
That's the biggest challenge of all, because you need a certain number of subjects, as they're called in scientific research, but you need a certain number of athletes that participate in these questionnaires and in these studies. It will be impossible to have a prevalence figure in small groups. The anonymity that you are seeking to get the correct answers, the true answers, will always involve large numbers of athletes, which is a bit strange. In order to get the right figure, you need to look at a broad population and as a large number of athletes. And then again, it will only tell you about that large number of athletes and not about the individual athletes. So in essence, prevalence measurements will always be something completely different than the anti-doping controls that we as anti-doping organizations are also performing. The anti-doping controls, we are looking at individuals, but the prevalence, you always need bigger groups to study. But as long as you realize that there are two different pieces of information, I think both have an important value in our work.
Certainly. And do you have ideas about what could potentially be done, Olivier, to improve the ability to estimate doping prevalence, whether it's for unintentional or intentional doping?
First, about the intentional, then it's the prevalence working group that we are working on right now. WADA is working on building a platform where this can be used. And I think that's important. Like I said, this can be used in the upcoming years, and it will give us a lot of essential information. The unintentional doping, the task force has only started just over a year ago. That's a little bit more new. So we need to do first the basic work of agreeing on certain definitions and what is the best way of looking into this and what are the potential ways of unintentional doping. It is very difficult to put a percentage on that already. The work started later, so that will take a little bit more time. What I am afraid of, and that's also my experience in my country, is that of the number of analytical findings that we have and that can be pursued as an anti-doping rule violation. And legally they are anti-doping rule violations, but there is a large percentage of unintentional doping involved. And the easiest way of explaining it is, of course, if they didn't follow the right education. At the same time, my educational colleagues do a lot of work there. But okay, some athletes just don't pay enough attention there. That will always be true, I'm afraid. But there are just certain things that people don't realize. How long does a certain medication or a certain drug stay in your system? And also there can be new ways. One of the biggest problems is that labs can find lower and lower amounts of prohibited substances. And in the end, you get to all sorts of stories. You don't know where these medications are coming from, where these traces of medications are coming from. And we are finding more and more problems there of unintentional doping. So that needs to be tackled. Absolutely.
Certainly. So I think that was a good segue for a later question I wanted to ask in terms of these task forces that you've mentioned. How did you originally get involved in these WADA task forces?
Well, they asked me. That's the simple question. But I hope it is also because I addressed those issues in my PhD thesis and in discussions at congresses and meetings, etc. I think it's an important task for WADA to back up all existing policies with the existing knowledge and the scientific knowledge, and doing that by building these task forces. And then it's important to have people from NADOs in there, people from international federations, athlete representatives, etc. You need the entire group. I always stress that. It's also my background from human movement sciences is also a rather broad study. It involves physiology, it involves psychology, it involves anatomy, pharmacology, etc. I am convinced we need all those expertises to solve our everyday problems. You need to have a multidisciplinary approach. And I can aid a little bit with that with my National Anti-Doping Organization knowledge and our perspective. But I will never be able to solve the problem by myself. We need many, many experts in this field.
Absolutely. So can you go into a little bit more detail about this unintentional doping research project that you and the task force are working on, and what are the goals or the aims of the work that you're doing there?
Yeah, like I said, we are still at the beginning of that. There's been a call for proposal has been sent out in the world, and people from all over the world have responded. There are really a lot of responses, I think more than 1,000. And we will report on that also transparently, but they're still in the process of collecting all answers. And in that way, we can see the different perspectives of all the respondents on this topic of unintentional doping. And then later on, of course, we aim to make some proposals on how to avoid unintentional doping in the end, on how to tackle this problem. And I think it should be done in various ways, but it's a bit preliminary to talk about that now. We will need more time to lay out those potential solutions. And then we need to discuss it with everybody involved.
Very good. Well, listeners, we'll have to keep an eye out for more information on this project. And I think throughout our conversation, we've kind of weaved in details about anti-doping science and some of the research that's going on in the field. Olivier, can you share why is it so important to continue to advance anti-doping science, and how do new findings from anti-doping research inform the work that you and your colleagues do at Doping Authority Netherlands?
When you find a athlete doping, that's always a terrible story. It's most of the times also a individual story that at some point you need to relate to it. Some athletes are being brought to do this. But I think we owe it, especially to the clean athletes, to create an environment that is as clean as possible and that they can excel at their sport and perform the best they can without having to use all these substances that in the end will also be a big health problem to yourself. You shouldn't have to have the conversation with a junior athlete. Okay, if you want to perform the best way possible, you need to inject this, you need to take these pills, etc., etc. Sport in itself is already dangerous enough, I think. It embodies certain dangers, psychological dangers, physiological dangers. And this is just something that should not be part of an elite athlete life. And that's why we need to continue to do this.
Absolutely. And you mentioned earlier this idea of desk research where you're really monitoring all of the new information coming out. How do you then make use of that new information?
That's not possible anymore because there's too many anti-doping science going on. It used to be possible, but there's just too much. And in that way, our call for multidisciplinary scientific approaches has been too successful, which is a good thing in itself, of course. In the end, it is a good thing, but we need to find out ways to follow that. Everybody will have his own specialty, and working in an anti-doping organization has become a specialty in itself. But I think there are various groups of experts gathering. There are a lot of scientific people involved. This is also an important work by WADA. There's been a lot of scientific research funds available, also on the sociological science part. And of course, the PCC plays an important part in there as well. Together with WADA, the PCC has been the cradle of increasing the anti-doping science. We try to follow it, but the number of scientific articles has grown so much that in most topics there have been reviews written, and those are the ones that we follow, and those are the ones that we base our work on, together with all the international standards and all the official obligations we have. But I also find it very important to follow these scientific review articles.
Definitely. And I think you brought up a really good point here that the volume of anti-doping research has increased tremendously over the years, which is really encouraging to see. And you do kind of have to leverage these partnerships and collaborations with other experts in the field to really keep a pulse on everything. So can you talk in a little bit more detail about these collaborations and partnerships with stakeholders, whether it's the PCC or others in the space?
I can just stress how important this is. Essentially, time-wise in two areas. First of all, the long-term views, you see potential problems coming, like what I explained, what we've done with esports. But there are also other things. Gene doping is an obvious example that we've been working on for 20 years already. Is it there or not? Nobody knows. But a lot of research has been put into that. And so we are as ready as we can be, I think, for these gene doping experiments that are maybe happening already or will happen at some point. But those are the long-term views, and then it's important to have these funding for scientific research. What I especially like about the PCC funds are the short-term financial backing that you can get if there's a current problem that you want to look into. I know many examples of labs that were involved or potential ways of maybe testing positive, mainly on the unintentional doping side of our work. And I think the PCC funds have tremendously helped in gaining more knowledge in that area. So I think it is important for both the long-term and for short-term scientific questions.
Absolutely. And perhaps could you comment as well on how you collaborate with other national anti-doping organizations? I think it's important that everybody's not working in their own individual silos.
That's true. The advantage we have here is that elite sports, and that's our main focus. We haven't talked about fitness sports yet. Maybe we should a little bit more, because that's also an important target group and a main problem. But most of the time we talk about competitive elite athletes, the Olympics, World Championships, and so on. And elite sport is by definition an international affair. That's what you want to do as an elite athlete. You're already the best of your own country, so then you want to compete against the best of other countries, which means that we as anti-doping organizations also should work together with our international colleagues. On a personal level, I find that a very nice part of our work. You meet a lot of interesting people with all sorts of different cultural backgrounds. But I think it's also essential to do our work properly, to work together. Like you said, you shouldn't work only in your own silo. Whenever you decide to tackle a certain problem, you should share it that you are working on it. And then later on, you should share your results. And in some instances, you just need to work together. Well, the prevalence is one topic that you certainly need to work together, especially if you want to have an estimate of a certain sport. Then you need, by definition, tens, so maybe 200 countries where you can employ your questionnaire.
Certainly. And I really like the point that you brought up about this idea of elite sport versus fitness sport. I think many national anti-doping organizations necessarily have to really focus on elite sport because those are the people who are beholden to the World Anti-Doping Code. But let's touch on this fitness population as well. Can you talk about some of the considerations for making sure that people who are in gyms and just kind of recreationally being athletic, what are some of the anti-doping considerations that people should have in mind?
I think whenever you put the health argument in your doping work, you should also look at the fitness areas. The number of people who are intentionally using doping substances, and you can discuss whether you should call it still doping, but then the performance enhancing substances or performance and image enhancing substances, the number of people who are using those is a lot higher, partly because there are no rules. The risks are a lot higher. And that's also where you see the main health consequences. And I think it's imperative that if you work in anti-doping, you should also look at those groups of athletes, because first of all, you learn from each other. Certain substances are being used in the competitive elite group or in the fitness group. In the fitness group, they are more openly discussing these things. So you learn a lot there about the substances. You learn about the practical consequences there as well. And like I said, the health consequences are a lot bigger as well. So I think it's important to look at both groups. We do, and we have done so for all our existence. And I always say that perhaps WADA should look into that group a little bit more as well. They always mention it, especially if a lot of drugs are being seized by the police or by other organizations. That's a big problem, and it's also our task to inform those athletes of the risks they are taking and try to curb that doping use as well.
Definitely. And Olivier, how do you reach these people if they're not required to complete the education modules that you're creating?
In my previous answer, I stressed the similarities, but there are also, of course, many different things between these groups. And you reach them by the forums where they are, but also the best way of reaching people is interpersonal contact, I think. So you should go to the gyms, talk to the people who matter to them, the trainers, the influencers. But it's true that your educational materials need a completely different approach, but it's nevertheless very important to do so.
Absolutely. And are there any other aspects of considering doping prevalence or doping in these different populations of inadvertent versus intentional doping, or in people who are in fitness sport or elite sport, that you'd like to share?
What is always important to mention is that most of the athletes do it without doping. They perform without doping. I am pretty much convinced that if you are looking for an overall prevalence figure in elite sports, it will be below 10%. If you're looking at an overall prevalence figure in fitness, it is probably not that much higher. And that might sound strange, but I think the amount of athletes in fitness are much higher. And I always like to refer them to my 86-year-old father, who is also a member of a sports club, lifting weights, etc. there are so many people doing that the number of athletes, and they are young, mainly, who are using doping substances, performance-enhancing substances, the percentage is rather low, but the absolute number is a lot higher. But what is important to stress is that whenever you have a certain amount of people practicing sports, whether it's just for fun, but also when it becomes really competitive and when it's in the end, it is all about winning, a large majority still wants to do it without doping. And this is what I stressed before in our very enjoyable conversation. We are doing this for the clean athletes, and they are still a majority. And as long as they are the big majority, we should continue doing this because they suffer from the minority who makes, in my eyes, the wrong decisions. But as long as the majority wants us to do this, we should continue. And that's true in both fitness and in elite competitive sport.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I think throughout our discussion, we've touched on just some of the many challenges and limitations that you face in the work that you do in anti-doping. So if we took away those challenges and limitations, Olivier, and we had all of the resources you could dream up, what is one problem in anti-doping that you would most want to solve?
I think what I should like to do is indeed have more prevalence measurements in the way that is least cumbersome to the athletes themselves, but make it sort of a standard short questionnaire whenever there's doping control, whenever there's big competitions. And I think on the analytical side, I would really like to put more money into looking into the possibilities of using saliva to identify different prohibited substances, because I think it's much easier if that could be done than in urine. I think it will be impossible to solve potential hematological related doping instances. I think we've come a long way already in using dry blood spots for that. So I think for the analytical side, using a combination of saliva and dry blood spots.
Well, Olivier, I love these dream projects that you've proposed here for us. I think these are two very worthy areas of anti-doping that there's a lot of people actively working in. And I know we covered a lot of ground in our conversation today. If you've piqued the interest of our listeners and they would like to learn more, what is the best way to do so?
First of all, it's a characteristic, I think. Always be interested, always be curious. I think you should listen to the PCC podcasts. And if you have any questions for me, it's easier just to go to the website of Doping Authority Netherlands and mail me. I'm not that much on social media. If I have all the resources in the world and all the time in the world, I would really like to learn more about that. Mm-hmm. But at this point in time, I still have not done that. I'm sorry. I follow it a little bit, but the best way of approaching me is just by mail or at international conferences, which I like to visit as well to learn more from my colleagues.
Fantastic. Well, listeners, definitely get in touch if you have specific questions for Olivier. And Olivier, it's been such a pleasure to chat with you today. Thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Thank you. It was my pleasure as well. Till next time.
That's right. It was wonderful to chat with you today. And listeners, it's always great to have you here with us as well. If you haven't already, it would mean so much to us if you could rate the podcast and leave a review and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. And listeners, please note that the Anti-Doping Podcast features a wide variety of clean sport experts, and episodes may include statements and/or viewpoints that do not necessarily reflect the views or values of the PCC. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Anti-Doping Podcast.